Great. Well, good evening, Commission. We'll begin this evening's regular meeting of the Planning Commission with a swearing-in ceremony for our new commissioner. And then we will turn it over to Chair Bauer to call the meeting to order. So, Mr. Kelly, if you would like to step up to the public comment podium.
Yeah.
And we'll go ahead and begin your oath of office. So please raise your right hand and then repeat after me. I state your name.
I, Kevin Kelly,
Do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States,
do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States,
the Charter of the City of Petaluma,
the Charter of the City of Petaluma,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States,
to the Constitution of the United States,
the Charter of the City of Petaluma,
the Charter of the City of Petaluma,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
of the duties of which I am about to enter.
Great, thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome, Commissioner Kelly. Your seat. Oh, you'll sign the paperwork. Welcome, Commissioner Kelly. We're very, very happy to have you aboard. So with that happy event, we'll now be calling to order the meeting of the regular meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, July 11th, 2023. Clerk, will you please take roll?
Vice Mayor Cater Thompson has reported her absence from the meeting. Commissioner Wisman has reported his absence from the meeting. Commissioner Rackison.
Here.
Commissioner Hooper.
Here.
Commissioner McKeerling.
Here.
Commissioner Kelly.
Here.
Chair Bauer.
Here.
5 commissioners are present and 2 are absent. This meeting has a quorum and can proceed.
Okay, we'll now move on to our next agenda item, which is the approval of minutes. We have 4 minutes to approve, and before I go and ask about each one, I wanted to know if anybody has any edits or changes to any of them. Okay, we'll go through one by one then, before that. Okay, so we'll go first for the first one, the approval of minutes of the meeting of May 9th, 2023. Does anybody have any comments for that one? Nope. Okay, so we'll go ahead and approve those minutes. And then we have the approval of minutes for the meeting of May 23rd, 2023. Does anybody have any comments or changes to that one? Oh, okay, we'll go ahead and approve that one then. How about approval of minutes for the meeting of June 13th, 2023? Okay, none. We'll go ahead and approve that one then. And our last one will be approval of minutes for the meeting of June 27th, 2023.
Now I'll make my
Rackison,
comment.
yes.
I feel bad putting you through that. No, this was for the meeting regarding Skinnell. And, you know, it starts out really well. It gives pretty detailed, especially about public comment, which I love, summarizes well. And then right around 8 o'clock, it kind of just says Chair Hooper facilitated questions from planning commissioners, facilitated comments. I just wonder if we could have added a little more detail there, because that's a pretty big project and there was a pretty vigorous discourse. I thought a lot of good questions and a lot of good comments. So and actually on the previous one on June 13th, I think you could say the same. So I guess it's more of a comment than anything, that we just kind of keep up the note taking about the gist of points, especially that commissioners are making throughout, even through the close of the meeting, because we want to have that record. So
Okay,
that's
thanks,
all.
Chair Atkinson. Well, thank you for your comment, and I think there's going to be a little bit of a change in the way the meetings minutes are done in the future, and I think our planning manager, Andrew, will discuss them. And do you want to discuss them now, or should we finish the minutes?
Sure, no, that's fine. I think it's relevant. We've been coordinating with the city clerk and with the city manager, and to be consistent with council minutes as well as with the minutes of other CCBs, we will be going to an action minutes, which relies on key actions that the commission takes, and then the video to support them. So, in fact, we'll be going to less detail in the minutes rather than more.
So we're moving with less detail, and we're relying more on video for
Correct.
people that want to get that kind of support. Okay.
Correct. I think the one difference is what we'll be doing is putting the times within the minutes. So, the time at which corresponding in the video where, commissioners ask questions, where public comment was received and such. So it will be easier to go to the video and find particular parts of the meeting and then review it.
Nice. Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead, and I want to just backtrack a little bit and say that the approval, the minutes for June 13th, Commissioner McCaroline provided amendments, and those are in the meeting minutes. Now they've been added. And then I'll also say that's also the case for our June 27th, 2023 minutes. Commissioner McCaroline also provided amendments in advance, and these are incorporated red line in the published draft minutes. So with those amendments, and we will go ahead, and I'll ask again if anybody has any more comments or edits. Oh, Commissioner Hooper?
I just mostly have a question to follow up on the change to action minutes. Will it be safe to say, though, that even though it's going to be reduced in the actual minutes themselves, that the reports going to council will be just as detailed or more detailed when it comes to specific items?
That's correct. We will, for those items that go to council, we'll report on what the commission has identified as, comments or concerns that they may have had. So that will be in the staff report for those projects that go on to council then.
Great. And I just wanted to add as a point that I know Commissioner Atkinson has brought up in the past, and we use some software at work for this. If there's any opportunity to look at speak-to-text recording for minutes, that would be ideal. And I know that's more expensive and down the road, but part of why I bring that up is just an accessibility issue for those folks who maybe can't access the video.
Sure, that's a great point, and I'll share that with both the city manager and city clerk. We're trying to align our minutes with the other review authorities, so that's really the primary intent of this action. There was also as well one thing I did want to mention. So for those items where commission would make a decision and that would be appealed to council, then we would also include that detail in the staff report as well.
Great. Thank you, Planning Manager. With that being said, unless there are any other comments, we'll go ahead and approve the minutes. And we'll move on to general public comment. There does not look to be anybody here. So I think we will move on, but I'll still ask the clerk if they received any comments prior to the meeting.
Yes, we received 3 general public comments prior to the meeting, all 3 of which were posted online on the city website, and they were also provided to you at your chair.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we'll go ahead and close general public comment, and now we'll move on to the presentation items. There are no presentation items, and we will continue on the agenda from here. So now we are going to move on to public hearings and matters for consideration. So meeting item number 5, the officer elections. The commission is to elect chair, vice chair, and second vice chair for the 2023-2024 period. So I would like to start it by nominating Vice Chair Hooper to be our new chair. Are there any other comments or other nominations for that? Well, can I get a second for that nomination?
I'll second.
Okay, great. So do we need to get a roll call vote for this? Or, yes, okay. Clerk, can we please get a roll call vote for nominating Chair Hooper, Vice Chair Hooper to the chair position?
Vice Mayor Cater Thompson, absent. Commissioner Wisman, absent. Commissioner Rackison,
Yes.
Commissioner Hooper,
Yes.
Commissioner McKeerlane,
Yes.
Commissioner Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Bauer,
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. It looks like that passes. Congratulations, Chair Hooper. That sounds very nice. We can move on to Vice Chair now, and Commissioner Wisman was the second Vice Chair, and normally I might nominate him to move up, but he's not here tonight, so we will not do that. So we will. I'll nominate Commissioner Rackison to the Vice Chair position. Commissioner Rackison, is that acceptable?
That is acceptable.
Okay, great. Can I get a second?
Second.
Okay, great. Let's get a roll call vote.
Vice Mayor Cater Thompson, absent. Commissioner Wisman, absent. Commissioner Hooper,
Yes.
Commissioner McKeerlane,
Yes.
Commissioner Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Bauer,
Yes,
all four votes in favor.
great, thank you very much. And then we have the other one, the last one, which is second vice chair. And I would like to nominate Commissioner McCarroline, if you're up for it. Commissioner McCarroline?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. Can I get a second?
Second.
Okay, roll call vote, please, clerk.
Commissioner Wisman, absent. Vice Mayor Cater Thompson, absent. Commissioner Rackison,
Yes.
Commissioner Hooper,
Yes.
Commissioner Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Bauer,
Yes.
all four vote in favor.
Great, thank you very much. Commissioner Kelly, you'll get your turn eventually. Don't feel left out. All right, great. Well, go ahead and congratulations, everybody. This is great. A complete changing of the guard. I like that. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to our future meetings with you, with all of you at the helm. And me not. So we'll go ahead and close meeting item number 5 and continue on. And we'll move on to now meeting item 6, commission liaison appointments to the advisory committee.
And Commissioner Bauer, before we go on, I'll just make a record that there's nobody in the public for
Oh, yes.
public comments.
Right,
Yeah.
thank you very much. That's true. Yeah. So commission liaison appointments to the pedestrian and bicycle advisory committee and to the tree advisory committee. So we'll go to the tree advisory committee. Commissioner McArlane has been on that for the previous term, and they're at a juncture right now that's imperative, and it's important that we would like, if he would like to, keep serving on that because of he has a lot of previous expertise from that, and I think it would be best served if he could continue his term. So Commissioner McCarroline, will you be accepting the Tree Advisory Committee appointment again? Great, thank you very much. Okay. And then we have the Pedestrian and Bicycle Advisory Committee, and previous that was done by Vice Chair Hooper, but we'd like to give someone else a chance this time, and now with Vice Chairs Hooper moved to chair position, I think he could use some more time to focus on being the chair. So I'd like to see if somebody else would like to do that. Okay.
I'd be very interested in being the liaison to pedestrian
Oh,
and bike
great,
committee.
thank you very much. I'll nominate Commissioner Rackison. I don't know if that requires a vote or not.
I don't think a
don't
formal
think it
vote,
does,
but if you
yeah.
wanted to, yeah, just ask
clap.
for some ayes. Yeah.
Okay. If you are in favor of Commissioner Rackison being appointed to PBAC, say aye. Aye. And congratulations. Thank you, and thank you very much, too. It's a big responsibility.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, we'll go ahead and close meeting item number 6. And we'll continue on to the Planning Commission workshop, our main item tonight. And I will hand it over to our staff to give their presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you and congratulations to your new officer positions as well as your committee liaison appointments. So we always appreciate the great work that commissioners do, both on the commission as well as with the other CCBs. So thank you for the additional commitments of time. While I'm getting set up here, getting logged in and sharing the presentation, we have the workshop is designed to really be sort of an open conversation. We, of course, to comply with Brown Act, we conduct this as a public meeting, but we really want it to be an opportunity for discussion, for question and answer, as well as to identify maybe some topics that we want to drill down on in deeper detail or greater detail that we could do so at a future workshop event. Know that, coming forward through the course of the fall and into early next year, we'll have a variety of ordinances and amendments ranging from amendments to the visitability ordinance, updates to the ADU ordinance, the objective development and design standards, and so forth. So there may be some discussion that we want to have in greater detail about ministerial versus discretionary review and so forth that we wouldn't have the opportunity necessarily to do this evening. So if you do have those topics, if they come to mind, just feel free to suggest them and we'll follow up then. Okay? And then joining me this evening will be Assistant City Attorney Dylan Brady. He'll be doing the heavy lifting on the key legal components in the presentation. And then also we are going to be, as I'll be talking about briefly, leveraging the Planning Commissioner's Handbook. This was produced by the Institute for Local Government. So we have made a couple of hard copies. If you want a hard copy, it's available in digital format as well. And give me just a moment. It looks like I lost my Zoom share. Well, I'm not used to there we go. All right, thank you. Okay, so the workshop this evening again is roles and responsibilities for the Planning Commission. And so our session goals, we want to introduce planning's legal framework both for the city of Petaluma, but also at the state level and federal levels. Then we want to explore public planning in Petaluma, what we do as a planning division, how we work with review authorities and so forth. And with a particular note that public planning is different from other types of planning, private sector planning, and so forth. Then consider the commission's roles and responsibilities and talk about a variety of topics that Dylan will lead. And then finally, identify future workshop topics as outcomes of this evening's discussion. So again, the basis and a great resource that we recommend is the Planning Commissioner Handbook. We will continue to utilize the Petaluma Planning Commission Handbook, which is developed and provides meeting guidance specific to our meetings. But as you can see from the table of contents, the Institute for Local Governments Handbook has a variety of topics that we don't cover within our local handbook. So the enabling legislation adopted by City Council specifies that the Planning Commission will be comprised of one council member who serves as a liaison to the council and 6 citizens who are appointed by the City Council. It does rely upon the police powers, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution and supporting case law, as well as State of California Government Code Title VII. And Dylan, if you want to take us on a brief walkthrough through those two.
Yeah, sure. So the 10th Amendment, it pretty much says what powers aren't reserved for the federal government, they are, or provided for the federal government, are reserved for the states. And then we have the California Article 11 of our Constitution that says the powers not enumerated to the California as a state, they are provided to the cities, counties, and the people. So that's where the city gets its police powers. And it's not police as like cops, it's police, P-O-L-I-S, from the Greek meaning city-state. And that's really the city's ability to regulate health, safety, welfare, morals of its citizens. So that is where we get our power to regulate. And we go into a little bit about some constraints for what our regulations are. And then Andrew talked about our enabling legislation. So I think that's probably okay. I do think we need to worry about preemption. So those powers reserved for the federal government and stated for the California Constitution, if the city, or if they preempt the city, then our regulations would be void.
Great, thanks, Dylan. And I think also to point out that when we talk about the police powers and how that's considered, we in part, cities implement that through land use, right? So when we think about land use, we think about how we have the orderly arrangement of the uses of land that ensure the public health, safety, and welfare, which then kind of harkens back to planning spaces, which really grew out of the public health needs of communities, especially during the industrial era. So there's kind of building that connection then between what we see as the powers of the city and then how that then translates into and is implemented through land use. Then another important document that directs the work of the Planning Commission is the implementing zoning ordinance. So that's going to establish the Planning Commission as review authorities for various discretionary entitlements, as well as the appeal body for administrative reviews that are completed by the Director of Community Development or his designee. So then a brief discussion about what is planning. And it's, you know, there's several key aspects to it. First of all, it's a proactive process. So we're really looking to establish goals and policies for directing and managing land use and development. And we think that about that, we do that through our policy planning work. And then we implement those policies and we actually manage land use and development through our development review. So the public planning process is really comprised of two areas of planning: policy planning and then development review planning. And we seek to address fundamental community issues. So they're looking at that location and type of development, infrastructure needs, mobility needs, housing availability, and so forth, as well as economic development. And then we also want to account for the future demand for services. We do that primarily through our general plan when we're looking at the long-term vision for the community and ensuring that we have the sewer, roads, and fire protection that we need. But as part of our discretionary review of projects that would come before Planning Commission or be subject to discretionary entitlements, we also have those reviewed by various city departments to ensure that we are continuing to meet the needs of land development. And then finally, that the planning decisions will impact public safety, public health, access to resources, environmental quality, and they can exacerbate economic and racial inequalities. So the two components that you'll be familiar with are our policy documents and then our regulations. So our policy and then our law or legislation. Policy documents would include the general plan, the Central Petaluma Specific Plan, for example, the River Access and Enhancement Plan. And each of those has varying levels of detail. Some of those policy documents can serve as to direct compliance with certain standards, objective standards, but they would have to be identified in the implementing zoning ordinance would have to refer to those policy documents in order for us to look to them for compliance. So oftentimes you'll hear us say that we find that a project is consistent with the general plan. So consistency is different than compliance, and we do look at them differently. Now then, when we turn to the regulations, to the implementing zoning ordinance, we're looking for compliance with the legislation. And sometimes that legislation will give us discretion and allow us to make a quasi-judicial decision about the extent to which a project complies with a law that's on the books of the city. So then this is an example of how we move from a policy goal to legislation or to regulation. And looking at Goal 1G2, Policy 1P16, and Program A, all related to development in hillside areas. So the general plan is establishing policies about how development should happen in the hillside areas. And then through the codification process, those policies are then codified in the implementing zoning ordinance and then become the regulations that can be applied through the quasi-judicial process. So it is always a two-step process that we're looking at, and we are differentiating between goals and policies, consistencies with goals and policies, and then compliance with regulations.
And Andrew, I'll just add too, that the general plan, that's pretty much the top of the city's hierarchy for land use. And then you have the zoning code and the specific plans. So you will want vertical consistency. You want to be, the IZO is consistent with the general plan.
And two, internally consistent. So there's also, as you'll see when the general plan comes forward, the requirement that the general plan is internally consistent. So then some of the key roles of Planning Commission. You know, as you all will know now, we convene Planning Commission in a public meeting format. Every time that we convene the commission, it is a public meeting. But then within that public meeting, we may hold a public hearing. And we'll always declare a public hearing. We'll always ask for ex parte disclosures. And then we'll always frame that public hearing with an opportunity for the applicant and the public to, present their project and the public to comment on the project. As we'll see later when Dylan talks about procedural due process, that's a key component of the right to due process. And so we always frame a public hearing within the public meeting. So we convene a public meeting, we take general public comment, we may have informational presentations. We had the SDAT presentation at the last meeting. This evening we're doing a workshop. And we also do the commission's business. The election of officers that we did this evening is doing the commission's business. And we do that in the public meeting. But then when we open a public hearing, then we may be looking at advisory recommendations that the commission is making to the council, and that's part of the legislative actions that the commission will take. So the commission cannot create legislation, only the council can create legislation. But the enabling legislation and the zoning code, the implementing zoning ordinance, do direct the commission to advise the council on certain legislative actions. Then we also have the quasi-judicial roles, and those are twofold. You have your discretionary approval or denial of a development project, and that's looking for consistency with existing policies and compliance with regulations. And then we also have a quasi-judicial role that the commission performs in the form of an appellate body for administrative decisions. So the quasi-judicial role really takes on two forms then in that regard.
And Andrew, I'll just add too. So as a legislative body that is creating large set of broad rules, and your quasi-judicial function, it is applying the specific application to those legislative rules. So recently, the Planning Commission and City Council adopted a zoning code amendment to require any general retail use above 25,000 square feet. They would require a conditional use permit, have some findings before that use permit is granted. So that is a legislative function. And then when you have a specific retail that's above 25,000 feet coming to you to get that use permit, that would be quasi-judicial.
Great. Any questions thus far? No? Okay. Sure.
I do. This actually clarifies a few things, and I'm glad to know that my obsession over the IZO was not unwarranted. One thing I did want to ask, though, looking at the quasi-judicial aspect of our role, so if we wanted to drive a change to the IZO, let's say we found a hole or there was an amendment we thought was a priority, since council's the one driving when policy is being created or when legislation is being created, is there a method for the Planning Commission to advise a priority in something being adjusted to the IZO without it being project specific? Because I recognize we do a lot of zoning amendments and a lot of ordinance amendments related to a project. But how would a Planning Commission drive that if, say, there was something we saw over a period of time that we wanted to see changed?
Sure, that's a great question. I think you could do that through a course of the meeting and just ask staff to make that recommendation to council and take it forward, and then work with the city manager, with the city attorney's office to process that request. While prioritization is extremely important, and because there's always a lot of work before us, and we're always trying to sort of we prioritize that work. We do look for opportunities to bundle amendments and bring them forward. So they don't always have to come forward as an individual amendment. We could bundle and bring forward. So I think that there's a couple of things that we could do. One is make that recommendation to us, and then just assign a level of importance to it. If you collectively feel that that is sort of a gap in the legislation that needs some immediate attention, then ask us to carry that message forward. But second, we do keep a running what we call the red line version of the implementing zoning ordinance.
Right.
And we redline it as we go along. So as the general plan update process concludes, we'll move into an implementing zoning ordinance update process. And we'll then turn to that redline document and start bringing forward for consideration some of the changes, the needs for amendment that we've identified. So we can handle that in two ways, and I think it would be important for us to know, the level of importance that the commission sees for a particular amendment.
And I'll just add to that too, Andrew. I think that's probably a good reason why there is the council liaison. So the council liaison can hear the concerns of the Planning Commission, gaps, take those back to council. Council also, I think it's around May every year, has their annual goals and priorities setting. So other commissions, I believe in the past, have had sort of a letter to council signed by whatever the commission is. Hey, these are the planning commission's goals, and hopefully council can take those seriously. And I'm just looking at the enabling legislation right now of the planning commission, and that's chapter 208 of the municipal code, specifically the duties section. And it says, the planning commission shall also have the duty of studying the needs of the city with respect to and advising and recommending this council concerning the establishment, modification, and change of zones or districts and designation. So I definitely believe that city council has delegated that authority to you guys to figure out where those gaps are and bring that to council's attention.
That's great news. Thank you.
And that's also an example of some commission business, right? So if you wanted to, if there's a recommendation that you want the commission to consider, then we can agendize that, put it on other matters for consideration, and the commission can take that up and formalize then a request to the council.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had just one more question so far, and it had to do with, let me make sure I have it. It had to do with when you were talking about the kind of the vertical consistency required and the difference between consistency and compliance for our area plans. And I was just wondering, just as a matter of procedure, when we make amendments to our area plans or when we implement a new, like the Central River Plan or what have you, is it automatically that, are amendments then automatically made into the IZO, or is that something that has to be agendized as a separate item in the future?
No, it's a separate process. So we would, you would adopt, like say you adopt a specific plan, and then in that adoption would direct codification, of certain components of the specific plan, depending on the nature of the policies and such.
And then staff would have to go back.
Right,
put that
and then we
together.
go back and we
it,
write.
okay.
Code writing is very different than
Right.
policy writing. So
Absolutely.
it really does need to be a two-step process. But then also, oftentimes, if we create a new regulation, we have to look for conflict with other regulations or integrate with other regulations, cross-reference, and so forth. So it's they're both fairly involved processes, but certainly it's something that we keep an eye on.
All right. Have we ever had a specific plan that, for whatever reason, we didn't get to the IZO adjustment, or thus far are we all caught up? Oh, I'm just curious. Just because of Petaluma's long history of,
Right,
That
that's a good
outdates all of
good
us.
question, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with its history to know. I was trying to think the River Access and Enhancement Plan has some very specific policies within it that when we look to that as a policy document, the guidance that's provided is oftentimes reaches that sort of objective standard level, and I think that perhaps not all of that has been codified. So
Thank you.
yeah, sure. Let's go to Commissioner Kelly. Is that yeah?
Well, I'm asking this as a complete newbie, and I know that these legal things are extremely important, and certainly in the federal government I dealt with them. However, here's just an observation. It seems to me that the process could be far easier and less expensive for both the developer and the city if we had a little bit more creative period in the beginning of a project. Here's what I mean by that. Let's take this hotel down here. The developer put forth a very detailed, a very beautiful rendering. The problem is that when you are confronted with a beautiful rendering like that, you don't really want to say, well, change something because you know how expensive it is to make a rendering like that. So why is that the first sort of thing we see? It seems to me that if there were some way through charrettes or whatever to really convey what the city's and the people's objectives are for this project at the very beginning, then you wouldn't have this delay of what I always called pin the tail on the donkey. You know, here's a design. You like it? No. Okay, here's another one. I changed this. Do you like it? It's a little better. And this process goes on and on and on. And what happens is it is so expensive for the developer and it is so exhausting for people. And I think that there's a bit different way of doing it, which doesn't conflict with any of this legal stuff. Yeah, Darren,
I was just going to say, Commissioner McErlane had recommended that for a project we just reviewed, Skinnell, and that project kind of went back to more conceptual drawings of site layout, gave us some options. So I think that's a great direction to move in.
and do you realize how much money was thrown in the trash by the developer? And see, you can only do that so often.
Right.
And also, they don't have any more money left to really be creative. That's the problem. They just say, well, this is the best I can do right now. And we say, okay, all right. This happens a lot with projects. It's how you begin. As Aeschylus said, that which begins poorly ends poorly. And that's what we've got to
And
change.
would that be administrative guidance to our planning staff when they bring it forward, when it's agendized? I don't know if that's kind of a thing with the developer and educating them here. Here's our first stage as a study session, and this is going to be almost a very conceptual study session. Is that something we can implement? Because it does sound like a
Yeah.
good idea.
We don't want to see pretty. We want to see ideas first.
Well,
And we'll get to pretty. But, yeah.
yeah, we can certainly. So it is the case that when an applicant or a development team comes to the city, they come to us at very varying levels. Sometimes they'll come to us at a very conceptual level and want to explore what is the city looking for. They might point to certain policies in the general plan or something and say, what's the city currently? How are they implementing that policy, or how does that policy look? What do they want to see? Other development teams may come to us with a more of almost design development level, and that really is difficult then to interject yourself into the process and bring them back to the conceptual stage.
Right.
And I think that, just with this study session for the Skinnell project, I think that's a great example of how the project, came back to the conceptual level, brought that forward then in the last commission study session, and in a way did a reset on it. So it does. We can look at how we communicate that and communicate that preference, but we are compelled to act on an application that comes before us. So
Right.
Andrew, a question though. It seems like the conceptual development, you need to define what that is. So it's not like, here's my idea, what do you think? It's here's 3 ideas and which one is more likely to succeed at. And I think that needs to be defined. Just right here, a study session. It doesn't say anything about what it is that you study. Or you're studying different ideas, and you want feedback on those ideas, or you say, this is just a cheaper session to do because it's a study. I mean, it's not clear to me that they know what they're doing. And I think they're also driven by engineers and architects who basically know how to do site plans, but maybe they're not quite as
Correct.
creative as so I really support what Kevin's saying, and I also think it'd be much fairer, you're going to get much better quality projects when it's a cooperative reinforcement process than it is denial. And,
Absolutely.
Commissioner McErlane, make sure you're speaking into the microphone just so the people, the millions of people listening can hear you.
The concept development is, here's 3 ideas, which ones do you think we have a better chance of achieving, or which ones do you favor more than others? And then the next level, they can follow that idea, but they come in with one idea and it's like, they go back and do 3 others before they, you know. So I think out of fairness to the developer, it ought to be defined what a concept development is and what's the benefits of going through that process.
Commissioner Hooper?
Well, I will just say I have never had a problem telling somebody who gave me a lovely drawing that it's wrong since we started here. But I will say what we just went through with Scanel was definitely a lot easier than the first time we went through Scanel, and we were quite furious with them. One thing I did want to ask is, because I've seen how other cities, their planning commissions operate, and to a certain degree, I'm wondering, has some of this been a byproduct of the fact that like we combined what used to be like a design review board and a planning commission into one entity? Because I'm assuming if we had a design review board in the first place, that would be where that would probably show up. And then by the time it gets here, we're just making sure it's a land use appropriate, right?
Well, when the design review board is integrated into planning commission, the planning commission did assume the responsibility for site plan and architectural review.
Absolutely.
So you are looking at if land use consideration is required, through a conditional use permit, then you would look at that separately. You are looking to some extent at land use when you're looking at site plan and circulation and so forth through the site plan and architectural review process. But you're right. I think that one of perhaps the unanticipated effects of integrating the design review board, but it was called Site Plan and Architectural
Yeah.
Review Committee, right?
Yeah.
I believe. Perhaps one of the unanticipated consequences was that the process removed that sort of, typical
Early phase.
design phasing
Yeah.
of going from concept to design development to, construction drawings and such. And so we can, we're actually updating our pre-application guidance right now, and we can certainly start to operationalize
could.
that and communicate that to the community.
It would also be helpful, and this is me agreeing with what's already been said, but it would also be helpful when you've got, like, I'll have people ask me, hey, why is this the first time we saw this project? Assuming that I've seen it, 4 times before when I haven't, and maybe the project was on hold for several years, and that's no one's fault.
Right.
But it would be helpful as we're kind of getting through our backlog to be able to have that first study session meeting where it is like what we did with Scanel, but instead of it being a redo, it's the first time, where we're very clear to the public and to everyone involved, hey, we're only asking these kind of questions because we're only looking at, do you like this area use or not, that sort of thing. Also, would probably keep those items shorter. But I do think that would be a more nurturing process for this. And then if the developer tries to skip past that and it is what it is, we'll just do what we have to do.
My experience is that they like guidance.
Oh, yeah. No, I
They
agree.
really like guidance.
I've yet to meet a developer who didn't want
Yeah.
that. But the only other question I was going to ask, it seems to me sometimes, like, for example, with Scanel, it was referencing site plans that were just blatantly out of date, right? Because the project was approved, that whole area was approved for development like 14 years ago, and then they had to move forward, and then things adjusted. My question is there a more proactive role we can take to help in those instances where we see, oh, okay, something's going to come here, and it's been quite a bit of time, and we probably want something else compared to what we wanted then.
That's the role of the specific plan. And it was a specific plan required for that site, but it was never done.
Right.
So what you're asking is that should have been done, and they should be able to follow it.
Fair enough.
Well,
So
yeah.
in that sense, I guess you could say we reject the project because there's no specific plan it relates to. Yeah, I mean, that's a requirement of the submittals, is it follows a specific plan.
I'm looking to Dylan because I think that
I would say if the specific plan was never adopted, then they don't need to comply with that. But I'm not too familiar with this fact scenario. I like the idea, Andrew, and I agree that we can take a look at the pre-application process to kind of, and I don't even know what that looks like, but to try to get the more of a design, a little more options. And then I would caution, there's a lot of recent housing bills that are trying to expedite this process to save time and money for these developers. And specifically, SB 330 only requires 5 public hearings. So I do agree that it would be helpful to have these hearings right up front. We'll just have to be a little more selective of choosing, what hearings. If we choose to go with a design hearing right up front, then we'll have to potentially miss one later on that we would normally do. So just something to think about. And I do think that's probably the state, just looking at the proposed bills, that's probably the future as well, is to try to continue to expedite these process.
Commissioner Hooper.
I actually want to follow up on that because thank you. You saved me a comment because that is, and it's not just SB 330. You're right. Like every other bill coming out is focused on how do we shrink the number of hearings. I was going to ask, because I recognize sending emails about what these projects are creates Brown Act issues. From like a functional perspective, if we've got, let's say it passes and we've got 5 hearings and you recognize that it's maybe using a hearing on design review might be problematic, or maybe we need to bump it up for whatever reason, it would be great if in one of the planning commission meetings prior, it might be part of the report of, hey, we've got these projects coming up. We've got, because of whichever policy they fall under, there's a limit to the amount of hearings. Where do you want to go with this? Just, or at least to tell us what we have to do with it ahead of time so we know when we eventually see it, why we're seeing it at that phase. And also so the public understands, hey, no, it's not that we want to limit public engagement. It's because state law has regulated us into this.
Great, thank you for that advice.
I mean, it seems like in the past 4 years, we've been getting a lot more study sessions than I saw in the past. So somehow I think the message is getting across that we want to see projects earlier. And the few projects that have come across without any design, just concept, I think those have gone really pretty well. So I think you guys are doing a pretty good job when you can get it early enough to say, let's just bring it in front of them now and see what their conceptual ideas might be, or, get feedback of what they envision for this site, rather than you actually creating some rendering, which we're going to later on, say that's terrible.
I mean, it can be
That's
a
not at
sketch.
all what we had in mind. So I think it's getting there. And I know that, when applicants do come to you at that early phase, and I, of course, would encourage them all to do that you'd say, let's just go in front, and that way you're not wasting your time. It just saves a lot of time at the end. So,
Right, I do think that perhaps one reason you're seeing more study sessions is infill development is complex. And that might also be why we're also seeing some sort of, return 2 or more times, is because it's hard to do. Certainly in comparison to Greenfield. So as our policies shift to incentivize and support infill development, I think we'll continue to see a more complex development process, but then also a more complex review process as a result of that, to the extent that the review process isn't driven by SB 330 or SB 9 or some other state regulation.
And just to piggyback off of that, I know a lot of times for these projects, the documents, the applications, they're on the city website pretty early on, well before we ever have a study session. And in this vein, that might be something we can add to our staff reports of just a heads up to planning as part of your comments. Hey, this project has applied, we're going to have XYZ number of meetings. And that gives the time for commissioners to do our own informal studying. If for some reason the timeline doesn't align with that, we'll have our chance to do it on our own and submit comments, that way individually. This is
Great.
another fail-safe.
Sure, thank you.
I do like your idea of writing really good pre-submission requirements or goals, or however you want to. I mean, that's that's, I think, been part of the federal government's design excellence that has really forwarded much better federal design than in the past. And the other thing I'd say is that, and I can supply, I know the Brown Act, we can't email each other and stuff, right?
Correct. Yeah, we'll get to that later. But yeah,
Okay,
uh-huh.
but I would put into I will give you a graphic from the Construction Industry Institute, which I love, which is basically 2 bell curves. And what it basically says is, as time goes by, flexibility to change decreases. You have a tremendous amount of flexibility in the beginning of something, because just shooting designs, ideas around doesn't cost anything. It's a cheap investment. However, if I decide to change my mind here, when the building's under construction, it's like, first of all, I upset everybody. There's all sorts of money issues, et cetera. So therefore, putting that money at the beginning of any project, putting that time at the beginning of any project really pays dividends. And I think that's a good way that you suggested of doing it.
Great. Well, thank you all. These are excellent comments.
One, Andrew, I'll just add too and it's again just how the state laws are coming down in the past and what it looks like in the future is those objective design standards are going to be so important.
Yes.
So that is something I think planning is working on and probably bring back this year, right, Andrew?
Yeah, that's our plan.
Yeah, one other thought, it seems like what Kevin mentioned is that developers are not all the same capability, and some need more help than others. And I think Skinell had no idea what they were walking through because they don't do residential, they do other types of. So I think some way, Andrew, of making sure they understand what they're supposed to be focused on at what level in early concepts and early direction are very effective, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all. Sure.
Just one final comment, and not to get off of the riff, I think we gave a lot of good guidance there, but just about the IZO, Commissioner Hooper brought up changes to the ICO, how they can be initiated, the IZO. We've seen projects where they come through and because of a certain element of an IZO, hey, we have to explain to the community, look, because of our current zoning code, this has to go through because it complies. This is the process. In those situations, is it, we're too late, we have to get out ahead of everything? Is there ever something we can do to say, look, this is a weakness in the IZO? I guess I know the answer to this question, I think, but we can't change it to say, look, this IZO is weak. We need to change this so we can't push your project through right now. That's not possible, right? Like once we've identified a weakness or zoning that lets something through that we don't really want through or we would like it to be strengthened, all we can do is close it up after, right?
Yeah, I would think that would be spot zoning, Commissioner Rakusin. So when we create these IZO and amendments, we try to make them generally applicable and not, one specific site. So, but that's something we can look at, hopefully
I think
if the developments come in early, maybe we can see a weakness and hopefully address that before it gets in front of you.
Okay. And then my other question was about CEQA. Are we going to cover that separately?
That is in a few slides. Towards
Okay.
the end, it's not a very in-depth one, but we can have a different topic or provide resources.
Just to
there
let us
to-
continue, I'll reserve my comment on that one.
Cool.
Yeah, and this is just the first of these workshops. So if we see something that we would like to be, addressed at a later workshop, like CEQA, maybe we could have a whole workshop on CEQA, which I think might be a good idea.
If we
So-
could do one on going through a negative declaration, I think that'd be helpful
Yeah,
for everyone.
yeah.
Okay. Great.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
all these topics are things I think we'll be giving you at the end, maybe, or can we later on? I guess
I think as we go along while they're
Yeah.
fresh. Yeah.
okay.
So
Yeah.
I've got CEQA down, so thank you for
CEQA
that.
and the negative
Right.
well, the neg decks are part of that. So, yep. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So going on then, when we talk about the public planning process and thinking about what Planning Division does, in its role here at the City of Petaluma, we have those three primary roles. The first is the counter planning services that we provide. And that can range from somebody who wants to construct a fence and has a question about what they can construct, all the way to somebody who might come in and say, I'm looking at this property, what's it zoned, what could I do there? And that would be the first step of a development process that could end up before the commission. So we really work hard to be responsive to all of the questions that we receive, and then to start to move the customers appropriately into a pre-application process or onto application, depending on the nature of their question. Sometimes we'll also advise them that they need to consult with land use professionals. Because in our public planning role, our public planning role is not to be that design professional that, works with you to develop a concept. We can provide feedback, when it comes to us, through a pre-application process, preliminary review. But it really is, that's where we differ between our public planning role and then a private sector planning role in terms of how we interact with the development teams and what we do. So then we go on to development review planning, where we do provide those pre-application services. We have a couple that we provide a development review committee meeting, which is where we convene city staff from all of the departments that really touch land use development. So planning, building, fire, the city engineer, environment, water, and public works, various divisions within public works, as well as the city attorney's office if necessary, depending on the nature of the application. And so we bring them in for pre-application service through DRC. That's a free service that we offer. And then if we do need to continue to work with them, we have a preliminary review application. I think, as everyone knows, if not, this is a good time to mention this, planning work is cost recovery. And so when we're reviewing applications, we need to recover the cost for that work. And so we do that through our cost recovery fees. And then also we receive the applications. We work with them on application submittal, ensuring that they have complete applications. And then we conduct the development review, depending on what the code specifies, would be the permit required, whether it's a discretionary entitlement that's needed, or if they would move straight to a building permit because it's a permitted use, perhaps, or development, single-family residential development that doesn't require SPAR review. And then, of course, we support the review authorities. So Planning Commission or Planning Division directly supports the Planning Commission, the Historic and Cultural Preservation Committee, and the Public Art Committee, as well as City Council when we take items before City Council or respond to research inquiries that they might have. And then we also take projects to PBAC, Transit Advisory Committee, Tree Advisory Committee, and so forth. And then finally, there's another team who works on policy planning. So we have a team who works on the general plan update, the tree ordinance update, writing the visitability amendments, the ADU amendments, and so forth, because that is a separate skill and has separate demands. And then finally, we have the CEQA team. And the CEQA team comes into a project as needed. So depending on if CEQA is required or if it's exempt from CEQA, we make that determination while we're reviewing the application for completeness, and then proceed accordingly pursuant to the requirements of CEQA. So here I'm going to turn it over to Dylan to take us through planning and the Constitution. So it's that legal framework that sometimes gets missed, but is so important when thinking about the work that we do.
Sure. So the Fifth Amendment, you have that due process clause, can't deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or process without due process of law. That's the federal government. That was incorporated to the states with the 14th Amendment. So, and that's really due process. Due process has both procedural and substantive due process and equal protection. And you could take a whole class on due process and equal protection. But the Fifth Amendment, Andrew, would it be possible to go back a slide?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. It's not included up there, but I do think it's important just to briefly mention the Fifth Amendment, that's also the takings clause, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Takings has both physical taking, that's, a city or let's say Caltrans taking over, condemning some property, they need to pay the just compensation for that. And then there's a regulatory taking, which we have seen argued in the past with some of our legislative actions when we have banned all future gas stations, or even the use permit for general retail above 25,000 feet or square feet. But that's a really, really hard standard. That's something we look into before we provide it to you. It's essentially for a regulatory taking that there are no other uses on the property and they can't use their property at all. So it's a really high bar. That's something that definitely my office that we look into. And then the 10th Amendment we talked about, that's the city's ability to regulate for the health, safety, welfare of its people. And then the 14th Amendment due process, and I think we have a couple slides on substantive due process and procedural due process. So substantive due process really is applicable when the Planning Commission is wearing its legislative hat. And anytime the Planning Commission or City Council, city makes a regulation, it cannot be arbitrary or capricious. It has to have a reason for that action. So let's say for the 25,000 square feet for retail conditional use, the city's reasoning for that was for aesthetics, concern about blight, make sure that these large box store retails are in the city's best interest, so it requires a use permit. If we were challenged on that in a court, we would just have to show that there is a rational reason for the Planning Commission and City Council to recommend and eventually adopt that. It's a very low bar. When you do start regulating fundamental rights, like if we were to say certain religions cannot be located in certain districts, we would need to have a higher bar for that justification, and we probably would be unsuccessful. But when we do bring you these legislations, we take a look, see if any other city has done something in the past, so we're not reinventing the wheel. If they have been challenged on these, the courts will say, well, yes, the city has a reasonable justification for enacting this ordinance for X, Y, and Z, and that's where we will have in our ordinance and our recitals what those justifications are. They can be done with statistics or just sort of, we believe that big box stores aren't in the city's best interests, especially downtown, where we want to keep it not big box story. So that's aesthetics, that's substantive due process. That's something that the city staff are concerned about. And then procedural due process is more when the Planning Commission has its quasi-judicial hats on. So procedural due process, it is both adequate notice to the applicants, and then it's a fair hearing. Fair hearing has several parts, but essentially it's the opportunity for them to have to rebut any witnesses, that their hearings are just as long as the city's ability to make its case. So you don't have planning and city staff talking for 20 minutes, but then limiting the applicant or the appellant for 1 minute. That wouldn't be an opportunity to present, that they are able to present their witnesses, cross-examine the city, that kind of stuff. So that's what a fair hearing. And then you have the impartial hearing body. That's really a couple things, and its bias and ex parte contacts are the main ones. And not having a conflict of interest, I would add as well. Andrew, do you think you could go to the next slide, please? So biases, they include conflicts of interest, and I think we have a slide at the end to talk about that. But I kind of look at it big picture. if you are making a determination on a decision where your spider senses are ringing, hey, optically this doesn't look good, let us know. We can take a look at it. It's a pretty fact-intensive analysis, but conflicts can be, I have worked for the applicant, I have investments in this business, my close family works for this business, I live within 1,000 feet of this application. So those are really the conflicts. Like I said, let us know ahead of time so you don't get in trouble and the application doesn't get challenged for void. So that's a bias, as well as prejudicial statements. And this is a lot of conflicting case law. So prejudicial statements before the application comes to you. Let's use a recent example with Scott Ranch. If you were to write op-eds in the Argus saying you are either pro or against it, you will come to the public hearing with a bias. So I always recommend just listening to proponents, opponents, saying, thank you very much, I haven't decided, I will wait to the public hearing before I make my decision. It does get a little confusing if you are running for city council, because you should be able to allow your opinions to be known to the constituents and the voters. So that gets a little more loose. You're able to say your opinion before the application comes in front of you for a public hearing if you're running for council. But it's still the safest thing you can say is I haven't made my decision up, waiting to hear all the sides in the public before I decide on and vote. Ex parte communications, and I think we talk about this a little later too, and it's important for findings, I'll add, is when the Planning Commission makes its decision, we want to make sure that it is on the record in case it gets challenged and later appealed. So it's okay. I think we want the Planning Commission to hear from the applicants, hear from the public, get their side. But we want to make sure that when you make your decisions, that you are informing the public so they can potentially rebut it, and the other commissioners, hey, I saw the site, I visited, I heard from the applicants and they told me this, and I'm going to make my decision from what they told me. That way they have the ability to rebut, and potentially the Planning Commission can hear that and make their decision as well. And that's important, like I said, for if we get challenged, the judge can weigh the city's and the Planning Commission's determination, and if there's substantial evidence in the record, then they will not overturn the Planning Commission's decision. So that's what I'll talk about bias. Happy to answer any questions, but if not, Andrew, maybe we could go to the next slide. And we kind of talked about what a fair public hearing is. There's some cases about an applicant, I think, that had it, or a planning commissioner that had its earbuds on. So you want to make sure you are listening, paying attention, just so the applicant, the appellant, feels like they are having their ability to be heard, that they have had notice. We can't say, hey, your appeal is going to be tomorrow night at midnight, something like that. They need their ability to present their evidence to the Planning Commission. And Andrew, anything you wanted to add there?
I think I'll just share that I was thinking that I advise planners that our product that, we generate when we work is both the legal record, but then also the process. And which is a bit when you think about the process being a product, but that really points to that procedural due process and ensuring that, every applicant that he has received his right, or her right to due process. And so in that sense, we want to ensure that our planning review process is fair, objective, consistent, and transparent. And so that product is what we look at. But then we also look at the product in the form of the legal record, the staff reports, the technical studies and reports, of course, the resolutions, but then also the testimony that we make as professional planners during the public hearing. All becomes part of that legal record and becomes another product that we deliver. So we've got a couple of slides that I want to touch on, and this may be another topic that we drill down on in a future workshop. And that's the ministerial process versus the discretionary process. So the ministerial process and these processes related to permit requirements are established by the IZO, and it's told if you need a discretionary permit, and then it provides the findings that have to be made and such. And then also you'll see in the development standards that may allow, for instance, a maximum height of 45 feet is allowed by right, but then you may have additional height of 60 feet that may be allowed subject to conditional use permit approval. So we'll see development standards that can combine both a objective development standard, but then also a discretionary development standard that could be pursued through the discretionary review process. But the ministerial process is really when an application is submitted, we're looking for compliance with regulations, including the zoning code, building code, and so forth. If a project complies, then the project is approved. So in those cases of ministerial permits, while we may have some amount of discretion, we are pretty limited in the amount of discretion that we can act upon or require. I think one situation that's relevant and recent is when we have a project that is eligible for SB 35 review. And so through state law, a housing project that is eligible primarily because it provides affordable housing then can go to ministerial review through the SB 35 process.
If, Andrew, they comply with all the city's objective standards.
Right.
And then, again, that's why objective standards are so important. And besides SB 35, I think the other ministerial are building permits. And then the only other one I could think of is the final map, but that's because they have already gone through the tentative map process with Planning Commission and City Council. And when it gets to the final map stage, it's really checking boxes, making sure they have complied with all the conditions of the tentative map. Mm-hmm. Yep.
A question back with the ministerial review process. I guess the question is, it's reviewed by staff, so we're assuming staff has the qualifications or the purview to know what they're looking at or what they should be expecting. In the case of this low-income housing at the roundabout, seems like staff didn't even think of what location that site was and what role that site had in addition to low-cost housing. So I'm a little worried about it. If the staff picks it up, fine. If they don't, then it goes through with over-the-counter.
Well, I think with all respect, that's an overgeneralization. So if, for instance, a project is located outside of required setbacks, then we may be limited on what we could say about where a building would be located within that area that's within the buildable area. So there is, we oftentimes work with the applicants and we'll try to produce a better project through the ministerial review process, but we do have to always be cautious of what we can require with regard to objective standards.
From a planning standpoint, that road requires a certain level of design treatment, landscape setback. None of that was considered in an approval of that project that is adjacent to it. So it seems like somehow that got missed. It's important that if staff doesn't have the vision to understand that, then I don't know how the Planning Commission could help do that, but I'm not sure how else it would happen. So I'm a little concerned about what might get dropped between the cracks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that project in particular is an example of where we need to enhance our objective development and design standards across the board. Yeah.
What project are you referring to? Which project are you referring to?
It's a project of a project was approved quite a while ago on low-income housing, right at the roundabout, north, or south Petaluma Boulevard.
Oh,
A
yeah,
new
yeah, yeah.
bridge crossing, which is a arterial highway connection to the rest of Petaluma. And the site was not aware of that important road and what it needed to do adjacent to it. So just the owner didn't know about it, staff didn't seem to know about it, and it just kind of got through.
Yeah.
And that project was, normally would have been subject to site plan and architectural review by the Planning Commission. However, it was eligible for SB 35. And so as an SB 35 project, then as Dylan pointed out, it's required to comply with objective design and development standards, and then would go on to building permit then.
And that's why those really are critical and should be very detailed,
Right.
because otherwise you're going to end up with God knows what.
And I'll just add too, all of ministerial, administrative decisions by staff, they are reviewable by the Superior Court. There's notices that are made available to the public, so they're aware of them. They can provide their recommendations or challenge it if they believe that it doesn't apply for SB 35. So, yep.
When are we likely to see updated or at least proposed draft for the objective design standards?
I would anticipate by October,
Okay.
we'll be bringing that forward for a study session initially.
Okay. And I just wanted to add SB 35 process to the hearings list, or to the review. I would add the SB 35 process to the
Okay,
review
great.
list.
Just a quick question building off of this. A comment you said earlier, Andrew, was even during discretionary staff review for that process that will eventually make it to Planning Commission, was I correct in hearing that in the public sector, you don't look at design considerations during that discretionary review process? We're talking about ministerial and how without strong objective design standards, in some ways your hands are tied in terms of what you can ask for in terms of design. It's not really your function in that process. But even during the discretionary review, before we see a Scanel or an Oyster Cove, is there a design ethos or design guidance that the planning staff is doing before we see an application or not? I think I heard not in your comment, but.
No, we do. We do.
Okay.
Yeah. So the discretionary process then, we received the application. We're reviewing for compliance with the IZO, but as well as consistency with, other policies, specific plans and so forth. And oftentimes those specific plans especially will contain design guidelines or policies that would affect design. So whenever after we conclude review, the next step then before we bring it forward to the commission is we prepare the staff report. And when we bring a project forward, we're making the same findings that the commission is being asked to make when they make a decision to approve with conditions or deny an entitlement.
And then does that also apply, we always have people asking about flood risk, things like that. Now, it may
Right.
not be elucidated in policy. Is that something you're also looking at beforehand? Again, outside the scope of what is written in code.
Well, absolutely, to the extent that a project may be located in the floodplain. So we do look at the evidence that's before us, and we would then look to the FEMA maps, to the current, flood maps, to see if that project is subject to floodway or floodplain regulations. If we didn't find it, if it's not located within a floodway or a floodplain, then we wouldn't be able to surmise that it's in an area that floods. So, I feel like maybe what you're questioning.
Yeah, that's kind of drilling in on that. And I know we're going to have revised flood maps, so that would take the place then of the FEMA map reference point. Would be updated flood mapping, right? That we're going to be I would imagine is being presented pretty soon, the updated flood modeling.
I believe so. Yes, yes. And I think though that process, I've not been engaged with that development, that project development, and so I'm not sure from a regulatory perspective what role those maps would play, if they would necessarily supersede the FEMA maps or not. But we'll check into that for you.
Okay, thanks.
So the discretionary review process, now it may be the case, and I want to go back to, staff making findings in the staff report and making a recommendation based upon our ability to make those findings. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're not looking to the commission to be more detailed or be more specific when they make their findings and condition a project. So we do take a balanced approach, and I think that's an important note. Then projects that would go to the Planning Commission for review, of course, you can approve with conditions, or deny. And any of those decisions that the Planning Commission makes may be subject to appeal. So they could be appealed either by a member of the public or by, what we refer to as an interested party, or they could be appealed by the applicant themselves. So there was an interesting case in another jurisdiction where I recall that a project was before the Design Review Board, and it had been an extensive review process. And the applicant actually asked the Design Review Board to deny the project so that they could then appeal it to the council. So appeal is open to anybody who wishes a different outcome of the decision. So then project conditions, discretionary projects can be conditioned. Ministerial projects we can condition lightly to some degree, and that's usually pretty unique to the project. But we typically will have standard conditions of approval, and then we would have project-specific conditions of approval. And I think Dylan is going to talk about nexus and proportionality, which are two very important concepts that we remain aware of and observe as we consider recommendations for projects.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So all of the conditions that the city needs to make needs to have a nexus, and that's kind of spelled out here. It needs to be related to what that entitlement is. So if an applicant is seeking a use permit to sell alcohol, we can't then require it to donate trees to the city or have trees out front, because that's not related to the alcohol entitlement. But we might be able to say, alcohol late at night that causes nuisances, you need to have specific lighting, or no music at a certain hour. So there needs to be a nexus between what the entitlement is. In that case, Supreme Court, the case was called Nolan, Nollan, and then you have the other one later on was proportional. In that case, Supreme Court case was Dolan, so you have the Nolan-Dolan nexus proportional. That's how they are called in the land use community, and that is proportional. So you can't require, let's say, again, the entitlement is seeking a use permit to sell alcohol beverages. We can't require them to donate 3 police vehicles because that's not proportional to the use permit. So those are really fact-intensive findings for whether the condition has a nexus and proportional. So it is recommended before the Planning Commission seeks to have a certain condition, let us know, we can do the analysis. And I would imagine, Andrew, you would talk to the applicant and see if they would be okay with it. And that would save me from having to do that specific fact analysis, because I don't think there are any case law out there about, whether a use permit for alcohol, if that's proportional to 3 vehicles. So we'll just have to do our best judgment on that. And anytime the applicant agrees, that saves the staff a lot of time. So that's what I was going to talk about, Andrew, there.
Great, thanks, Dylan. And then too, it's, when we think about project conditions, it's oftentimes difficult to enforce what we refer to as behavioral conditions. So if there are conditions regarding the operation of an establishment or a nuance to an operation, the enforcement of that can be challenging. And so enforcement would come down to a complaint made to code enforcement and then code enforcement following up. So we are always aware of the nature of the conditions, and we're always looking at, how can we enforce that condition to ensure success. And then findings, you are all familiar with findings. You're required to make findings as you make your decision. And those findings, they explain, they tell the story of how you analyzed the project and how you were able to find either and make a decision to approve or a decision to deny. And then all of your decisions have to be supported, and you have to be able to support them through your findings. So we may have, typically you'll see, like, you may have a finding that says, the proposed land use is compatible with surrounding land uses, and then you'll have that clause in that, and then that's where you're making that finding that in that